Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're unpacking really one of the most enduring, complex exchanges in intellectual history. That's the flow of ideas between East and West. We're diving into sources that don't just celebrate this, but kind of hold a mirror up and ask, what got lost in translation?
That's right. And our mission really is to look back, but through the eyes of Asian thinkers, philosophers, commentators. We want to examine those Western interpreters. You know, the famous names like Schopenhauer, Jung, Alan Watts, who helped popularize these traditions in the West.
Right, see both the light that definitely shed, but also maybe some of the unintended shadows they cast on the original ideas.
Exactly, because this meeting of cultures, it's never been just academic, has it? It really mirrors how civilizations interact from way back.
Yeah, you think about the Ming Dynasty, Jesuits bringing Western clocks to China, or much later, German philosophers discovering Sanskrit, the Upanayans.
It's always been this, dance. Fascination, definitely. Curiosity, yes, but also quite often misunderstanding.
And a key driver, historically anyway, seems to be the West looking east for something it felt it had lost, especially after the Enlightenment. That sense of maybe deeper wisdom.
That's a big part of it. And the challenge now, I think, is moving beyond just translating, which, as we'll see, often distorts things, towards a real integration, where ideas genuinely transform both sides.
Okay, let's unpack that first wave then. The heavy-hitting philosophers, mostly 19th century, who started using Asian thought, especially from India, to critique their own Western traditions.
And we really have to start with Arthur Schopenhauer. You could argue he was the first major Western philosopher to systematically draw on Buddhist and Indian sources.
Right, in the world is will and representation.
Exactly. He found in the Upanayans this, coherent framework for his big, rather grim idea that life driven by this blind, relentless will is fundamentally suffering, what Buddhism calls dukkha.
And people listened because he was giving post-Enlightenment Europe a kind of sophisticated metaphysical language for its own, maybe, existential angst, turning Eastern ideas into high culture pessimism almost.
He did, and it was profound, but here's the thing, it was incomplete. And that incompleteness sort of set a pattern, didn't it?
How so?
Well, Schopenhauer absolutely grasped the illness, the suffering, but he kind of stopped short of the cure. He didn't fully get the non-duality, the path to liberation or realization that's central to both Vedanta and Buddhism.
So he proved Eastern metaphysics could be rigorous, could speak the language of Western philosophy.
But by focusing mainly on the negation, the suffering, he accidentally cemented this view that Asian thought is primarily about therapeutic pessimism. He missed the ultimate goal, the transcendence.
Okay, that really sets the stage. Now, across the Atlantic, you had Ralph Waldo Emerson and the American Transcendentalists.
Right. Emerson absorbed the Bhagavad Gita, the Upanishads, and he really ran with that core Vedanta idea. Atman equals Brahman. The individual self is the absolute reality.
His famous line, "The currents of the universal being circulate through me. I am part or particle of God." Very uplifting.
It is, and that spiritual democracy definitely resonated with Indian thought. But, and it's a big but, it got filtered through a very specific lens. Protestant individualism.
So the emphasis shifted.
Completely.
Gotcha.
Instead of dissolving the ego into the cosmic whole, which is more the Vedanta path, it became about celebrating the self-reliant, inherently divine individual.
I love that comment someone made that Emerson made Vedanta speak with a Yankee accent.
It nails it, doesn't it? It shows how even universal truths get a kind of cultural flavoring in translation. It became spirituality as self-empowerment, not self-surrender.
Okay. Then there's Friedrich Nietzsche.
Yeah.
He apparently didn't read Eastern texts deeply himself.
No, not systematically like Schopenhauer.
But his ideas, things like eternal recurrence, his critique of moral absolutes, they seem to echo Taoist or Buddhist ideas.
There's a fascinating, if complex, convergence there. And Japanese philosophers, particularly from the Kyoto school like Nishitani Keiji, they saw this. They actually used Nietzsche's idea of nihilism, the collapse of objective meaning, as a kind of bridge.
A bridge to what?
To understanding Zen emptiness sunyata. They saw Nietzsche as someone who recognized the void that Zen actively engages with.
But the critique, from an Asian perspective, might be that Nietzsche stayed trapped in that heroic individual ego stance.
That's the core of it, yes. He saw the void, maybe intellectually, but he refused to kind of let go and fall into it. unlike a Taoist sage who aims to dissolve into the flow of the Tao.
So Nietzsche's Übermensch stands defiant.
Defiant and alone, exactly. He couldn't surrender that heroic will. It's not just individualism versus collectivism, it's about how you relate to reality, to power. Nietzsche confronts it, the Taoist aligns with it.
Okay, so that's the philosophers trying to grapple with these ideas academically, but the real explosion happens when these concepts leave the university, right? Section 2, psychology and pop culture.
Absolutely, this transition is key to how these ideas spread globally. And Carl Jung is pivotal here. Maybe the first major Western thinker to take Eastern symbols truly seriously on their own terms.
Not just as curiosities.
No, as expressions of a universal unconscious. His work with texts like The Secret of the Golden Flower, his interest in Kundalini Yoga, Tibetan Buddhism, it all deeply shaped his psychology of individuation. The mandala for him wasn't just art, it was an archetype of psychic wholeness.
That's a huge shift, isn't it? From Schopenhauer's metaphysics to the inner landscape of the mind.
It is, and this is where it gets a bit ambiguous. Asian scholars often admire Jung for opening that door to the spiritual unconscious in the West, but they also sometimes criticize him for, well, reducing transcendence to a form of therapy, translating yogic realization into a psychological process.
Meaning his Taoism becomes about achieving inner balance within the personality.
Rather than the radical dissolution of the self into the Tao, which is closer to the traditional goal of enlightenment.
So for Jung, it's about becoming a well-adjusted, whole individual, not necessarily ceasing to be an individual in that ultimate sense.
Precisely. Though, we have to say, Jung's language archetypes and so on, it remains a really important meeting point. His influence in Asia is still quite profound.
Okay, then we get the real popularizers. The ones who brought these ideas to a mass audience in the mid-20th century. Hermann Hesse with Siddhartha, Aldous Huxley with the perennial philosophy.
Yeah, these writers saw Eastern spirituality as a vital antidote to Western materialism and the alienation of industrial society. Their impact was huge, especially on the counterculture.
But their engagement, was it deep or?
It was often quite selective. They were brilliant at extracting the mystical essence, the feeling of it, but they tended to ignore the nuts and bolts, the daily disciplines, the importance of lineage, the rituals, the specific doctrines of liberation, the soteriology.
So they grasped the beautiful ideas, but maybe not the hard work involved?
You could say that. Swami Prabhamananda's comment about Huxley is famous for a reason. He understood the words, but not the music. They describe the mountaintop vividly, but maybe skip over the steep climb needed to get there.
Which leads us perfectly to Alan Watts, probably the most eloquent voice translating Zen and Taoism for a Western audience. For millions, he was the sound of Eastern thought.
He was incredibly articulate, no question, and yet he remains pretty controversial, especially among traditional scholars and practitioners in Asia.
Why the controversy?
Well, the tension is this. He absolutely democratized insight, made complex ideas accessible and appealing, which is hugely valuable. But the flip side is the accusation that he trivialized the practice needed to achieve that insight.
His Zen felt a bit too easy.
Some described it as instant Zen and his day as effortless. He often presented these deep traditions almost as a quick intellectual fix for uptight Westerners.
Like spiritual fast food, maybe?
That's a harsh way to put it, but it captures the critique. Did he open the gate for people, or did he just pave over the actual path?
I like that Japanese observer's quote you mentioned. Watts was not a Zen master, but he opened the gate.
It sums it up perfectly. He made non-duality a household concept for many, and that's a powerful legacy, even if he perhaps smoothed over some of the inherent difficulties.
Okay, now we need to zoom out quite a bit, because all this philosophical and spiritual exchange was happening against a much bigger backdrop, the rise and global spread of Western science.
Absolutely critical point. This created arguably a much deeper divergence in worldviews than the philosophical debates ever did.
How so?
Well, if the philosophers were translating Eastern spirituality into Western concepts, science was translating the cosmos itself into just matter, energy, and measurable laws.
Right, so traditional views like in China or India saw the universe as this vast, living, interconnected organism.
Exactly. Think of Ziran in Chinese, that spontaneous natural flow, or praxi in Sanskrit nature, as this active primordial matrix. Western science fundamentally brought in the metaphysics of the world as a mechanism.
A machine. Something separate from us, an object to be measured, analyzed, controlled.
Precisely. It stripped nature of its inherent sacredness or consciousness, you could say.
What was the effect of this mechanistic view when it hit China?
Initially, in the 17th century with the Jesuits, there was real admiration for the precision, especially in astronomy. But by the 19th century, under military and colonial pressure, adopting Western science became a matter of national survival.
That famous maxim came out of that period, didn't it?
Yes. Chinese learning for essence, Western learning for application. Trying to keep the cultural core while borrowing the technology.
Did it work?
Not really. That distinction just eroded over time. As the scientific mechanistic view took hold, that older, organic Taoist cosmology started to get dismantled. Qi, the vital life force,
Became just energy.
yeah, in the purely physical thermodynamic sense, it lost its deeper spiritual and moral dimensions. And Turiran, heaven, which had this profound moral authority, gradually became just the sky.
You can really feel the cultural loss there.
Yeah,
What about India? How did they react to the dominance of Western science?
it was a bit different. Indian thinkers often tried to show compatibility to translate their spiritual traditions into scientific language. Swami Vivekananda, famously calling yoga the science of consciousness, is a key example.
Trying to frame ancient wisdom in a way that modern science-respecting people could accept.
Exactly. It was partly a defensive strategy under colonialism, but the education system itself, separating traditional learning from modern science, often created this. Well, some call it a split consciousness.
Meaning?
Empirical, scientific, pragmatic on the outside, especially in public life, but holding on to a more traditional spiritual worldview inwardly, India still navigates that tension today, you could say.
But here's the beautiful irony, isn't it? Just as Asia was absorbing Western science,
The West started hitting the limits of its own purely mechanistic view. Quantum physics, ecology, systems theory, they all started pointing back towards interconnectedness, complexity, things that sounded oddly familiar to Eastern ears.
the circle starts to close.
It really does, especially around the 1970s. Fritjof Capra's book, The Tao of Physics, was a sensation back in '75, precisely because it drew these explicit parallels.
Between quantum physics and Eastern mysticism.
Yes. Quantum indeterminacy, the observer effect, deep interdependence. He connected all that to Taoist paradoxes and the Buddhist concept of pratityasamutpada.
Dependent origination. The idea that nothing exists on its own, everything arises together.
Exactly. The ultimate statement of interconnectedness. Capra argued that ancient Eastern intuition had grasped something about reality that Western science only reached after centuries of reductionist analysis.
And that convergence, that dialogue between science and spirit, it's still ongoing.
Very much so. You see thinkers like the Dutch philosopher Gabriel van den Brink arguing for a transcendent naturalism. His point is that empirical science, by focusing only on the measurables, cut itself off from meaning, from quality, from value.
Which resonates strongly with Asian traditions where nature was never just neutral stuff.
Never. Knowing was always tied to being, to ethics, to living in harmony. The universe had inherent value.
So bringing it all together, that critique seems to hold.
Right.
The West often took the pearls from the temple and remade them into jewelry of its own design. Beautiful, perhaps, but disconnected from the original context, the altar.
That's been the pattern, yes. But the encouraging thing now is that the dialogue feels much more like mutual transformation. Asian thinkers have absorbed Western science and rationalism on their own terms now.
And Eastern traditions are globalizing, adapting.
Right. You see Chinese Confucian scholars engaging deeply with climate science, framing it in terms of harmony. You see Buddhist monks collaborating with neuroscientists to study meditation with incredible rigor. It's moving beyond just translation towards, hopefully, real integration.
And this is all happening as the world center of gravity, economic, political, cultural, is shifting towards Asia. The Asian century, as people call it.
That shift is undeniable, and it really requires the West, perhaps for the first time in centuries, to move beyond a position of dominance or moral tutelage and genuinely engage, to develop real cultural literacy.
To finally listen to the whole message, maybe, not just the bits that fit the existing Western framework, like with Schopenhauer or even Watts.
That's the hope, to move beyond those fascinating but partial truths.
So for you, the listener, here's maybe a final thought to chew on. If the 19th century belonged to Europe, and the 20th to America, perhaps the 21st belongs to Asia. And maybe the deepest promise of that shift isn't just about economics or politics. Maybe it's about restoring a kind of global balance between matter and spirit, progress and harmony, intellect and intuition. Maybe the West being forced to truly listen is the key to a shared, deeper global awakening.